This podcast is part of the Midwest Podcast Network. Find out more about our other shows and how to support our network at MidwestPodcastNetwork.com. Welcome to Gone to Texas, a podcast about AMC's Preacher. My name is Alex, and I have not read any of Ennis and Dillon's Preacher.
And my name is Nick, and I have read all of Ennis and Dillon's Preacher. Not Dillon. I don't know who Dillon is.
I don't know either. But today we will be discussing Season 2, Episode 5 of the AMC series titled Dallas. While we will not be spoiling any of the comic and by extension any future plot lines of the show, we will be discussing the details of the series through Season 2, Episode 5, so pause this and go catch up before you listen to the rest of the episode. You can find more episodes of our podcast at g2tpodcast.com. That's the letter G, number 2, letter T, podcast.com. And we're also G2T Podcast on Twitter. And you can send feedback to g2tpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you think of our podcast and share your thoughts on AMC's Preacher so we can read them on our show. Send us corrections, observations, or anything regarding Preacher or our podcast, much like two of our most favorite people did this week.
Mm-hmm.
We had a new listener, Mike, email us. He had a few different thoughts here that I'll run down. I cherry-picked through several of the emails that we had back and forth, so hopefully he's okay with that. But one of the more important things that he wrote in was actually a correction, or not necessarily a correction, but last week we were theorizing about who the person who the Hell superintendent lost track of was.
Yep.
He wrote in and said, I thought the person who the superintendent of Hell was talking about who escaped was the Saint. Remember, Fiore and DeBlanc went to Hell in Season 1 to free him. And it was said that wasn't something that happened often. Not crazy about the Hell Hitler story, or the Hitler/Hell story so far, but we'll see where it goes. Thank you for writing in. Nick and I had that slipped our minds last week, so that is much more likely than DeBlanc doing crazy things.
Yeah.
In Hell to get Eugene out, but
sabotaging Hell.
Yeah. Next point from Mike, he said, I'd be interested to know what Nick thinks about Comic Tulip. Personally, I thought she was the worst thing in the book. She was clingy and whiny, and I never understood what Jesse saw in her, especially because in the book, it's clear that he can pretty much have whoever he wants. TV Tulip is much better. I feel like we touched on this in Season 1. I don't know if Mike necessarily listened all the way through, but how do you compare contrast comic and TV Tulip since they're so different?
It's a really valuable question to ask, actually, because Tulip is the character in Season 2 who's having the most light shed on her.
Yeah.
And so she is evolving. I won't disagree at all that TV Tulip is very, very good. I don't know if better is the right word, but definitely more developed.
Yeah.
Because Tulip in the books doesn't hit a lot of development until a little bit later when you kind of learn a little bit about her backstory. And Tulip in the book is definitely sort of, I don't necessarily want to use the word needy, but she definitely requires a lot of Jesse's attention. But I think it's, as a reader and it kind of with an overview of the whole story, I think it's pretty warranted because she definitely keeps Jesse sort of, not even grounded, but she's kind of his motivation. And he loses sight of that, I think, as Jesse in the show is doing presently. He's getting very wrapped up in his hunt for God, and he's getting very caught up in himself and his own like manly things, and he's so worried about doing what he thinks is right, what he thinks is important, that he's not paying attention to the people who care about him and who he cares about, which I think is a pretty well established trope with a lot of like very overtly masculine characters, that they get caught up in their business and they shirk everybody else.
Yeah.
And whether it's consciously or unconsciously, some characters do it knowingly. Some do it as a defense mechanism. And part of what makes Jesse interesting, I think, is he is so focused on doing what he thinks is the right thing, which is often a combination of his dad and John Wayne and himself, like rolling up together into what the right thing is to do, that he sometimes forgets about like the simple things, like just living a good life with Tulip, who he loves. But this is getting a little bit off track. But I think it ties into this week a little bit, and it kind of ties in a little bit to Tulip, because I think Tulip sees that side of him. Tulip in the books sees that side of him that's a little more simple, and I think that's where Tulip between the books and the show really contrast, and that'll come up heavily in this episode.
Yeah.
They almost have like kind of a role reversal in the show, which is really interesting, kind of a character reversal. But I don't think Tulip's the worst thing in the books. I think clearly Arseface is the worst thing in the books. I've made that known. But he's not without purpose, and I think the same is true for Tulip. I don't think there's any wasted characters in the book. So just because I don't necessarily like Arseface doesn't mean that he's pointless or he's bad.
Yeah,
I've probably said that he's bad before, and that's just kind of my disdain coming out inappropriately. But looking at it objectively, I think everything in the book works really well. There's a reason I think people keep coming back to it and why it needed to be adapted in the first place. They have to pick and choose what they're going to trim from the books, but it's interesting how they're kind of beefing up everything on it, and there's not a lot that's being trimmed necessarily.
Yeah.
So I'll be interested to keep going. But I am due for a refresh on the books, as there have been a couple episodes now where details have slipped my mind and I haven't been able to remember. And we were talking with Lance, who has guested in season 1, and he'll make an appearance at some point in this season. And he said, he's like, I kind of prefer that you don't necessarily have a death grip knowledge of the books. And I think that's part of what makes stories like that really cool. I mean, there's things that you kind of forget, and as you go back and read, you rediscover. And a story that long, you're naturally going to forget some of the finer details, and that's what keeps it refreshing and keeps you coming back, and you kind of find new things every time. I mean, there's even shows like Arrested Development that I've watched the complete thing a dozen times, and I still go back and I find new things.
Mm-hmm.
So having a encyclopedic knowledge of it is a great thing if you can do that, but obviously I've read it a couple times, and I do tend to read it in just like straight binge fashion, which, as we've talked about on this show and other shows, binging is the best way to forget.
Yeah.
So
to make it all meld together into one glob.
Yeah. So I probably should do a more thorough, like, disciplined read through where maybe I read like an issue a day and kind of reflect on it. But the problem is it's such a page turner.
Yeah.
It's just like when John was watching season 1 of Preacher, and he was like, I just want to keep watching it because it just keeps you going. So TLDR, I don't think Tulip's awful. I actually like comic Tulip quite a bit, but
there's different things to like about both.
There are different things to like, and it's definitely a bit of a long haul through the book until you get to the really good Tulip stuff.
Yeah.
But I think part of it is also she's a character who's struggling a lot with things that have happened to her and what maybe her true nature is against like what she's been brought up to be, and also dealing with the world around her. Like, she has to deal with a lot of characters that treat her like she's a woman in a man's world,
Yeah.
And sometimes she reacts in very interesting ways, and sometimes the book doesn't really capitalize on that. I think where you are right is that the show is definitely calling more attention to Tulip's reacting to a lot of external stimuli, whatever it be. She doesn't take anything laying down.
Yeah, that's for sure. Mike had a few other points that I want to come back around to after we've done our discussion.
Okay, but these are
about this episode.
Really excuse my weird voice today. Something's happening, I'm not sure what. They're really good questions, though. They're awesome questions.
Absolutely.
And they're not even necessarily questions so much as like discussion points.
I think I've sufficiently goaded Mike into writing to us every week, so I hope we hear more from him.
Maybe I'll get on the email and we can actually keep talking, or
there you go.
Maybe Alex will withhold all knowledge and spring it on me until we're recording.
Yeah, that's the best way to do it, right?
Yeah, right.
Our friend Yoop, that's been with us for a long time, wrote in as well. I picked a few things out of his email here, but he wrote in. Yeah, we miss you, Yoop.
Miss you, Yoop.
Yes. I like the season overall, but I agree last week's episode was the weakest of the series, but a small diamond is still a diamond. One of the great things this show does is sprinkling bits of information. I think they strike a great balance between obvious and subtle because I notice them, and I hear Alex mention them as well, but they're not in-your-face things like Marvel sometimes does. Now, I included the Yoop's email here because he had a few things that I know that you wanted to hear more about. So he says, now on to Hitler. I have a problem with him being in the show. And for the context of our listeners, Yoop is from the Netherlands, so I thought it was pretty useful to have the thoughts of somebody in Europe, at least, about this entire situation, as we come from a kind of a more clearly like distanced look at World War II, not only through time, but also geography.
Yes,
so.
And Yoop is very insightful.
Yes.
Which I value very much.
So now on to Hitler. I don't have a problem with him being in the show, but I can see Nick's point about him. My opinion is that through comedy, you can talk about some aspects of the event of World War II that you can't do otherwise. You're less likely to offend someone if they know you're trying to make people laugh than to drive home an opinion. For example, if you're trying to show where Hitler's hate for Jews comes from with a serious approach, then people might think that you agree with why Hitler started the Holocaust. But if you play it off as a joke, people will take it less serious, but still make them think about why he did it. The outrage that comes with a serious approach is less likely to blind you with comedy. South Park is a very good example of a show that does this very well. And then he finally goes on to say, I don't know if the show is using Hitler for this reason or not, but the stuff you guys talked about in relation to Arseface made me interested to see where they take Hitler in this season. My only hope is that he won't become a regular cast member and will go on adventures with Arseface or something.
My God.
Yeah. Well, he is a regular cast member, technically. He's in the credit sequence.
That's true.
But obviously, this episode, we didn't see him at all. The first 2 episodes, we didn't see him at all. So it sounds like people take kind of a backseat. But what do you think about Youp's thoughts on Hitler?
There he goes with that insight.
So Youp's thoughts on Hitler. That the idea that they're going to take, they're looking at it through comedy to ensure people that they think Hitler's thoughts were ridiculous and off base and terrible and wrong.
We did kind of talk about that. I think on last week's episode, how there's no coincidence and there are no accidents in the characters that are in the show, and the writing is all very intentional.
Yeah,
I think a lot of that comes from Sam Catlin helping guide the minds of Rogan and Goldberg.
Yeah,
and I think that they wouldn't do it in a way that would be offensive, and I think part of my initial knee-jerk reaction is part of the like overtly PC culture that we live in today. And I think this is also, I don't want to relegate that to America, but it feels like a very American thing. Like these days, everybody's up in arms about everything. And I don't want to downplay the impact of Hitler. Obviously, Hitler's a very real big thing. Like of the things you're allowed to get upset about, I think it's pretty fair.
Yeah.
So, but I think we might be judging it a little bit hastily, but I think the apprehension is valid. But also, Youp makes a very good point. Obviously, the show is not a comedy per se, but it has a lot of comedy in its DNA. So I
think it's going to come down to what we see over the rest of these episodes.
Yeah,
so.
and there seems like that's going to play out in the middle or latter half of the season.
Yeah, we'll have to tune back in. It seems like they're spacing it out a bit.
Yeah,
with nothing being in episode 5. So
no, I think it's a great point though, and we'll have to kind of see what happens. I am glad that they were not in this episode.
Yeah, me too.
I needed a breather from it.
Me too. So on to our recap of episode 205. That's Dallas. The teaser. Jesse
Dallas
hangs.
Roberts?
No, not Dallas Roberts. Sadly,
that'd be so good though.
AMC mainstay.
Mm-hmm.
Not a mainstay because he was in one season of a TV show that they got rid of.
He's a mainstay in our hearts.
Although I think he was on Walking Dead. That's Miles, right?
Yeah, I think he was on Walking Dead.
He was on Walking Dead briefly. But anyway, we digress. Jesse hangs Victor up in his torture room despite Tulip's protest, and then he uses the word on Tulip to get her to leave. That's pretty much all that happens
Savage.
in the teaser. I was surprised, and maybe we still have yet to see more of the fallout because they obviously cut away from Tulip at the end of this episode pretty quickly. But I was surprised that there wasn't more fallout from him doing that.
Yes.
They apologize to each other about it, but...
Yeah. I think that's the important thing to remember is like, it's not necessarily a one-sided offense.
Yeah.
Was it right? No, definitely not, especially when she told him not to do it again. But clearly Tulip has been withholding a lot of serious stuff from Jesse.
That's true.
And Jesse is a very sensitive guy for how tough he is. So they know each other so well, and she knows that this is going to.
She probably gets it.
Jesse's going to have kittens over the situation.
She's like, I'll give you this one, but never again.
Yeah, pretty much.
I could see that happening.
I think it will probably get brought up again because it's obviously a slippery slope if he uses it the one time. It's going to get easier and easier to use. However, they know the threat of using the word.
Yeah.
They know what's coming. So
yeah. So Act 1. After Tulip lost the baby in Dallas, she and Jesse were living day to day, doing everyday normal jobs. Jesse day drinks while hanging out with the stoner named Reggie and is supposedly a bartender, while Tulip has been a real estate assistant / training to be an agent. Tulip has Danny over for dinner, who wants them back in her service, but Jesse declines despite Tulip potentially being open to it. And after dinner, Jesse and Tulip check a pregnancy test to see if Tulip is pregnant, but she's not. So they try once more. And then in the morning, Jesse wakes up. He spots Tulip holding a stool well away from the bar, but she managed to dismiss him from it. So this episode was the hardest to summarize in the short fashion.
Yeah.
Because these flashbacks are so rich with detail that it was hard for me to pick and choose what not to say, or what to say and what not to say. But so this episode fills in that gap between the Carlos incident and the premiere of Preacher, essentially.
Yeah.
And I found that interesting, although I do have one bone to pick with it, which we'll get to later. So I guess the first real thing to talk about, one of the things that I enjoyed was the treatment of the Bible in this scene. The idea that it's been used to prop up the window. We cut to it, seeing it propping open the window. Reggie pulls it down to use the pages as rolling papers. And Jesse kind of notes the misuse of the Bible, I guess you could say. There's not much on his face, but you know that he takes note of it.
Yeah.
And then we see Tulip put it back there, and she's definitely the one who's been putting it in the window,
right.
It seems. I thought that was an interesting little detail of even though Jesse doesn't necessarily seem particularly religious in the scene, he still has that in him to be aware of how people think and are treating God in his life.
Yeah.
Which I thought was cool. But I think, is this the first mention of John Wayne on the show? Because I think it is. I don't think we've had any other.
Feels like they mentioned his name in season 1.
They may have, but it's not anywhere in my notes apparently for season 1. Okay. So maybe there was no John Wayne.
Maybe not. I know we've talked about it a lot.
Yeah,
but it was, I was very happy to see it, to see Jesse just kind of watching John Wayne over and over and over and over again.
Yep. Plus, there's a portrait of John Wayne above their bed too, which I thought was pretty good.
Yeah. I have it's not big, but a decently sized picture of Clint Eastwood that's really cool. So I can relate to that. Yeah. It's like a pencil sort of sketched version of a picture from the Outlaw Josie Wales. It's really, really tight.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I was always more of a Clint Eastwood guy than a John Wayne guy.
Yeah. That's fair. Clint Eastwood to us does feel like the right age difference between John Wayne and Jesse anyway. It's that generational.
Yeah, it's true.
That's your father's favorite actor kind of thing,
right?
Probably.
Yeah, it's tough because Clint has been kicking around in westerns since the '60s, so he's not he's no spring chicken either.
Yeah, that's true.
But John Wayne is more like your grandpa's favorite, and your dad by proxy then also loves John Wayne, but also likes Clint.
Yep.
I think my dad likes Clint better than John Wayne because we used to watch, not a lot of his westerns, but a lot of his other stuff too when I was growing up.
We get to see Danny again this episode for the first time since season 1.
I loved that scene. It's
a pretty great scene. There's some good lines in there. But did you read into it to me the same thing as it seemed like Tulip was inviting her to get them back into Danny's service, Jesse kind of questions why Danny's coming to dinner.
Yeah.
And Tulip
It did seem a little bit like she was at least open to hearing what Danny had to say.
Yeah.
Whereas Jesse had his mind made up.
And he just shuts it down.
Which is a very Jesse characteristic.
Yeah. But Danny does talk about an insurance scam in Santa Fe, subcontract work for a guy in Louisiana, which is obviously Victor.
Mm-hmm.
And then also she apparently wants her husband dead in Houston. Funny. Pretty good. So Danny says to them, "This is what you do," and Jesse replies, "Not anymore. People change."
Mm-hmm.
And then Danny's like, "What? No, they don't." I felt like that was like a pretty good summation of like you can't fight your nature, which seems to be a pretty big theme of the show. But did you have any other thoughts about the opening acts?
I have a note from it applies to this, but it also I wrote it during a later scene. But I just wrote I really appreciate the power of a good wig. Like well done hair pieces and like makeup can really put a character into a different place. And I'm referring specifically to Jesse. Coupled with Dominic Cooper's performance, like it really feels like an entirely different person, and it's phenomenal.
You can
I also
tell.
noted I really like him as like a mini Danny McBride, because that's who he kind of looks like. And like a lot of the scenes where he's going down to like the mart, the liquor store, he just has this look on his face of just total disengagement from everything. And it's hilarious, but at the same time, it's sad. And at the same time, it's just wondrous because he's so talented. Like he's just such a good actor.
Like this stuff almost makes me want to look at like a little bit more chronological presentation of things just to watch those performance changes of like Jesse. Catatonic Jesse is kind of like has big differences from even Preacher Jesse in season 1, and then coming on to like current Jesse
to possessed Jesse, Genesis Jesse.
There's certainly the way that he portrays those different states are very interesting, and it's great that he has that range.
He is phenomenal. And Ruth Negga too. I mean, she is so in the scenes with Jesse, like washing the dishes and like looking on the pregnancy test and everything. She's so sweet and so earnest, and she really seems like she's willing to give this thing a try for Jesse. You know, talking about the real estate and going to work every day. She just is like very appropriately captures that kind of feeling of like the housewife, and she and he both want to turn over a new leaf. He, as we've come to find out, she's putting on a bit of an act later on, but she's even more power to her, to both the character and to Ruth Negga for being able to put that across.
Well, when he finally turns the dime on her and she...
I totally bought into it. I was like, oh wow, she really wants to give this a try. Like my notes halfway through the episode are just totally inapplicable now because
you're like, this seems very out of character for Tulip.
No, I didn't think it was out of character. I thought it was really interesting because the whole montage in the middle, which I guess we can get to. We can progress to that. Yeah, I mean
it's kind of hard to separate a lot out of the flashback stuff, especially the episode cuts back and forth. So we'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
Act 2, Tulip arrives back at Denise's apartment with her stepdaughter Allie, and Tulip hits Cassidy for telling Jesse where she was, and she seems to think Cassidy's trying to tear her and Jesse apart. Cassidy leaves to go talk some sense into Jesse.
That was important that Tulip suspected that.
Yeah, and there was more to that, particularly later in the episode, that I wasn't really aware of the first watch through the episode. Like, I think I've become so enamored with Cassidy that I give him more of the benefit of the doubt than he should actually have. Which it's great.
Oh yeah.
But
it's working.
We can get to that in a little bit, I suppose. Did you have anything else to say about this one? Because it was pretty short as well. It was. I just thought immediately I was glad to take note that Tulip was a little bit suspicious because Cassidy is he's always kind of he's along for the ride. He's been along for the ride the whole time, and it's kind of that like, what do you really know about him? Do you really know him, or do you know who he's putting on? Yeah, I think in the last episode you kind of commented on the fact that they're both kind of bought into Cassidy, and it seems by the end of this episode that they're both a little bit more taken back and thinking about him in a different way. Well, Cassidy's a lot of personality. Yeah. But you don't really know the person behind it. You know the act he puts on. Yep. But you don't necessarily know what lies behind it. And I think partially because we as viewers of the show have been able to see backstory on Jesse and Tulip. Yeah. We feel maybe a little more in tune with them, and that we might know who they are underneath the surface, but it's also,
evident in their interactions with each other and with other people. We get what they're about. And Cassidy is, as Jesse puts it later in this episode, you think everything's a joke.
Mm-hmm.
He's definitely putting on a bit of a show.
Yeah. Act 3, Tulip and Jesse are living the same repetitive life over and over again, day drinking, trying to have a child, watching TV with Reggie. This was that montage that you spoke about. One day, Jesse realizes a blue bag handle sticking out of the HVAC vent, and he finds Tulip's money and birth control. When confronted, Tulip explains that a normal life isn't really the life an O'Hare is meant to live, and Jesse gets high and mighty about it when Tulip turns it back around on him, saying that as a Custer, he's never going to get the forgiveness that he seeks. Jesse tells Tulip that he found out he still owns his dad's church and that he's heading back to Annville to be a priest. That's a lot. So, like, yes. I feel like there were two, Act 1 and Act 3, both packed a lot in there.
They did.
I felt a lot better about this montage than I did the first couple that we saw this season. It felt like I remember hearing for Breaking Bad that Dave Porter was always using... He would set a metronome to the scenes of like Walter White walking out of a building furiously to kind of figure out where he wanted the music to be.
Okay.
And I felt like that pacing, I think, was what was missing from some of the montages earlier in the season. And I felt like this one, the way that it kind of slowly built to the point where you see that scene where Jesse prays over the pregnancy test. And then after that, it gets back to this quick cut, like, very choppy but well-made montage of these different moments showing the monotony of their days.
Yep.
I think this one felt a lot more skillfully put together than some of the first ones.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Yeah.
I really liked it.
I enjoyed that quite a bit. So Jesse tears down the facade of Tulip, obviously. So I got a little bit I'm a little bit mired down in what happens in that part of the scene in terms of like the argument that they have about, like, do you feel that Jesse seems very angry that she's not legitimately trying to have this normal life.
Yeah.
And do you feel like Tulip does this weird thing where she brings up the O'Hare part of it, but then partly blames it on Jesse. Do you know do you get what I'm saying? Because she says, I'm an O'Hare, like she's blaming it, she's using it as an excuse, but then Jesse kind of blames her for it. Like it was a little bit muddy to me. Obviously, not like arguments are always extremely well structured.
Yeah, especially in the heat of the moment like that. I think, well, to address the first part, I think you were asking, like, was Jesse really giving it his best shot?
Yeah.
He probably needed to give her a little more credit back when things seemed on the up and up, because he didn't really seem to be doing much except hanging out with his buddy. And like you said, supposedly a bartender. We didn't see.
We never see him tending any bar. It's like Tulip told that to Danny just to kind of like put out the air and like just put on that face.
He definitely is sulking, and I think feeling sorry for himself, and not necessarily feeling sorry for both of them. And I kind of said, melodrama Jesse is in full swing. And he has these moments in the books where when things don't go his way, or when maybe not necessarily when things don't go his way, but when he has reason to be a little bit down, he really leans into it.
Yeah.
And he kind of just is like, whoa, and like really wallows, and is like, poor me. And she kind of seemed to attribute that slightly to being a Custer too.
Yeah.
She was kind of like, you're going to get a shitty job and live a shitty life because you think it's what you're supposed to do. Almost like you think you're supposed to punish yourself.
Yeah.
Like you're supposed to like live in a state of, like you said, kind of a catatonic lifestyle.
Yeah.
As if that's like your penance. And she seems to think the other way. You need to just get back up and get back to what you're good at or what makes you happy. And I don't think either of them are right necessarily. I think Jesse's idea was good. His goals were good, but he was just
his execution
was acting like a baby about it. Yeah, exactly. Like a total deadbeat.
Yeah.
Which made me feel sad for Tulip. And then I also I was angry at him, but I also felt bad for him. I was like, he doesn't realize what an asshole he's being.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like he's a a guy of intensity and I think real passion. And when people like that, when they're high, but when they're low, they're very low.
Yeah.
And I think the subsequent betrayal of his friend and loss of the baby just kind of put him into a state of shock, you know? And Tulip maybe is the stronger one in the relationship in that she is able to bounce back and says, I'm going to do what I need to do. However, she's also doing it because she wants to do it. So could she just get the job, the 9 to 5, working as a realtor's assistant? Yeah, she could. And that would also be doing what she needs to do, but she likes being a criminal. Yeah. As Jesse tells Victor, she married you because she wants to be a criminal. It's a criminal lifestyle she's into. Yeah. I did refer to Reggie as Proto Cassidy in my notes, but I realized that Carlos was actually the OG Cassidy. They always have this third wheel guy who's kind of an idiot. And Reggie was more of an idiot than both Cassidy and Carlos.
Absolutely.
Combined.
Carlos is just kind of a dope.
Yeah, and kind of and yeah.
Reggie's just really stupid.
It's just stupid. And Carlos, I remember you cited fault with this, especially in season 1, that his ultimate reasoning was like, you guys seemed happy and I didn't want you to be happy. Yeah. It was a really weak motivation, and I agree. Yeah. And Reggie has zero motivation, literally, as a character or in his own life.
He's literally there to fill space.
He had to get punched. Get the shit beat out of him by Jesse. Yeah. But it was a very good sequence. I liked. It was a good way to establish the monotony of it, and without repeating the same shots, which I thought was very cool. They had like different angles of things, and it would be like a 2-shot of Jesse and the cashier, and then it would be like a single of the cashier later. It was just a night, like they didn't just go shoot one series and then recycle the same shots. Yeah, they actually
kind of like the Saint, even like the Saint of Killers montage, or even the Eugene montage. I feel like both were pretty. They were using those same things.
Well, I think that's okay in that context.
And yeah, absolutely. But because in this case, it feels like they shot these scenes like 7 different times from completely different angles.
Yeah, and just handed a bunch of stuff to the editor and was like, make it. Yep. And I think that was awesome. Like, it kept me interested, and I liked that their clothes never really changed. Yeah. I liked the scenery never really changed. It was just definitely drove home that idea that if you were one of these characters in the moment, you might not necessarily realize what your life is. The same. Right. But then when you're looking back on it is when you have that kind of hindsight, and people go through these slumps in real life. And I'm sure in the moment you're like, well, tomorrow it'll be better. And then, another week goes by, another few weeks, another month. And I don't know how much time really has passed.
Yeah,
it seems like a couple months.
That's part of what I want to get into.
Because there's a lot of Bible ripped out, and to the point where it will not support the door or the window. Yeah, and the Bible's a pretty thick book, so it's a lot of pages.
And I noted at one point that there was also, like, I think it was Jesse, but maybe not. You only see the hand come in and flip the Bible right side up. Yes, because Tulip or whoever was always putting it there down, like with the text towards the bottom on the spine, and part of me like wants to make that like, well, Jesse still isn't that committed to God, but he goes and rearranges it as like a
perhaps. Yeah. I chalked it up to like a structural integrity.
So, and that
it wasn't working anymore.
Maybe that's it, and so they just flip it over and hopefully it works that time. That's entirely possible too. I don't know.
But I like that. Yeah, that is true, because he, especially towards the end of that whole montage, he's a little more in tune. I mean, the prayer is one thing.
Yeah, and then also they attend church, and you see Tulip kind of tune out of it all while Jesse's intently listening.
Yeah, and he's actually like slicked his hair a little bit. He's actually kind of putting
in a little bit of effort.
Yeah, exactly. So and something about this is calling back to him, and maybe it is sort of defaulting to what he grew up with. Yeah, which Tulip clearly didn't enjoy his dad.
I think that's pretty much it.
I think there's a lot there. We could probably talk a lot more about the montage, but ultimately it wouldn't really yield anymore. But I think it was really well done, and I didn't mind that it spent a lot of time in that kind of gray, just aimless area of their life, because it definitely helped set the tone for why one of them or both of them decided they needed a big change. Yeah. And it's sad, because as much as they do love each other, I think that kind of stuff happens to couples, and it really tests you as a couple, as an individual and a couple, because Tulip clearly loves Jesse enough that she's going to stand by and deal with him just sitting and smoking all day and not doing anything. Yep. Hopefully thinking he'll snap out of it, and he's in there somewhere. but at the same time, she can't trust him with her, life of crime she wants to get back into.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was interesting. It was very, very telling of their relationship.
Mm-hmm. It provides you a lot of context to where things were at the beginning of season 1.
This was this is my last note of the episode. This was a story that a backstory I didn't know that I wanted to see.
Interesting.
I'm always a big fan of when movies and TV will just jump right into it with characters, and they let you either fill in the gaps yourself through either the show's well written, and so you can kind of pick up where these people came from.
Yeah.
Or it just doesn't matter. Or you can you decide what you want and just go with that. But so something like this is something I would not have been like, yes, please, I want to see what happened. Because I really liked.
We weren't begging for the answer of what happened in between.
Right.
It wasn't even something that we necessarily talked about on this show.
And even in season 1, when we knew what Carlos did, we knew that she lost a baby, and we knew I could fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
In my mind, it was like, okay, Jesse probably just started drinking heavily, and Tulip was sad, and eventually one of them ran out of the other. They drifted, yeah. And that was good enough for me.
Yeah.
But it was very cool to see it, and I think again, obviously, a lot of credit to the writing, but to the two leads. I mean, they're just so phenomenal, and they have such good chemistry with each other that it really it's fantastic.
Absolutely.
To watch these two go.
On to Act 4. Cassidy finds Jesse at Victor's house. We learn Cassidy was once rich, and he seems to almost tear up when he's thinking about it. Jesse asks why he would ever trust Cassidy again, and Cassidy agrees that there's not a good reason to do so. But he says that he's there to let Jesse know whatever he decides, he'll be with him. Jesse thinks it's over for him and Tulip if he kills Victor, but Cassidy thinks in the end, he and Tulip would make it through, unless, of course, he's lying. So, Cassidy being rich, is that harkening back to some of the Cassidy backstory you're talking about in previous Gone to Texas episodes?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think, if anything, they don't talk a lot about his family life in Ireland before he is turned into a vampire. I would imagine being from probably like semi-rural Ireland. In the, if we're spitballing Cassidy, he says how old he is, right? In the first season, he does.
Yeah, I can't remember
that time period. He probably was not wealthy.
Yeah,
I think in the book he was not a wealthy guy.
And the way that he phrases it here, because he says, "Did you know that I was rich once? Yeah, bloody years ago. I really quite enjoyed it. Actually, it sounds like it's something that he came across at some point in his life. It wasn't like part of who he was."
The beautiful thing about Cassidy is he's just this giant blank canvas, and they they don't have to stay as true to his origin in the show.
Yeah.
So if it was revealed that he fell in with like a band in like the 60s and was their manager somehow and made a ton, I'm kind of thinking that his origin is going to be that he was from a wealthy family when he was a young man.
Interesting.
I would love to see that, to see somebody who had it all and squandered it.
Lost it,
and has been spending the last 80 years just driving themselves deeper into, rather than, he's going the Jesse route rather than the Tulip route, rather than pick himself up and make something of himself and embrace his gift, or he views it as a curse, and he's just been like
wallowing in his mess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And living for the single serving moments that he does, like with, he has such a blast with Fior. But ultimately, it's just this hollow thing, as junkies, I think, generally always are. So I'm really curious to see what they're going to do with that. But I did really like that moment. Honestly, this is the most development we've gotten out of Cassidy in this one scene, and probably the whole series.
Well, and the emotion that's on his face is so good at that part. Like it makes me want to go back and rewatch it a few times just to try and like glean a little more out of it, because he's like kind of close to tears and kind of like, but he's still looking back at it very fondly.
He has his own moment, separate from his conversation with Jesse, and it's very good.
Yeah,
I have a lot of notes about Cassidy peppered throughout the episode. One of them just says, "Give Joe the Emmys."
Yes,
give him all the Emmys.
Absolutely, I would agree with that for sure.
I liked his line about the sheets, saying these are silky bastards.
Yeah, these are, and then of course he harkens it back to the foreskin conversation.
Yeah. There we go.
He's hundreds on these.
He talks about his considerable wisdom.
Yeah.
So I had the note, melodrama Jesse is in full swing earlier, and then
Yeah.
I wrote dark Cassidy is here too, because there's a dark side to Cassidy, and I like that we've had a moment here in this season where which is good, you kind of had a recognition of like, maybe I need to put my guard up a little bit with Cassidy.
Yeah.
Or maybe just like not take everything he says at face value. I really want to know if other more casual viewers of the show are going to feel that way, because the power of Cassidy, he's so endearing, he's so charming, and he's so likable, and he's just a fun guy. Like, you want to like him. It's not just like you will like him if he's likable. You want to, and you want to be his friend. And I think he has seduced a lot of like people that are watching the show. A lot of fans or viewers, even just general folk, are probably watching. They probably just love Cassidy, and they're like, oh, that lovable scamp Cassidy. And I wonder if it's going to register with people that there's like some maybe not red flags, but there's some signs in this episode that maybe he's not necessarily on the up and up, and maybe he's not acting in everybody's best interests.
Yeah, I mean, it was weird because I watched this, right around when it aired on Monday night, and when I watched it, I just kind of took it all at face value. And Cassidy's like, "Oh, I think you and Tulip, Jesse Custer and Tulip, like, would that ever not be a thing?" Essentially, and I kind of was like, yeah, Jesse and Tulip can make it through anything because they've made it through a lot already so far, which is kind of a valid point. But coupling that with Tulip putting her guard up earlier in this episode against Cassidy, and then also Cassidy's kind of sarcastic relief about the situation being over at the end of the episode, like, those two things together made me think like, oh, maybe he is actually trying to put a wedge between them. And I don't know.
Right.
I don't know what his motivation to do that would be, other than to just like be with Tulip. But other than that, like,
you guys were happy.
Yeah,
I didn't like it.
He really is Carlos, isn't he? But yeah, no, I mean, there was a lot of, it's a different side of Cassidy that we see in this episode for sure.
The only part of the dynamic that doesn't really jive as well with me, I'm not wild about how early in the series Jesse is a little wary of him.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned in last week's episode, I think, or maybe 2 weeks ago, they're like
in the thick of it, best buds,
bosom buddies for like the first enormous chunk of the book, and just total blind like admiration. And it's totally that Cassidy is so he seduces people into loving him, and Jesse falls under that spell, and they are genuine friends, because Cass is also the only guy who can hang with Jesse, who can like drink like him and wants to get into a bar fight every night. Yeah. And like lives a little wild and free, kind of like all of Jesse's idols, like John Wayne. He just lives life however he sees fit in the moment, and Jesse is like totally into that idea. Mm-hmm. So I didn't love the scene where he was kind of like, because he's talking it out with Cassidy, and then he finally kind of turns to him and is like, why would anyone trust you? Yeah. And while it was really good, it was a great scene, and these guys are just awesome opposite each other as well. And I liked that there was kind of this like kind of face-off moment where they were both kind of like sizing each other up a little bit differently, maybe. I thought it was a great scene, but it felt maybe a little bit early. Okay. So, but then he kind of quickly is like, Jesse's kind of like, with my friends, and Cassidy kind of diffuses the conversation.
Cassidy seems to diffuse it pretty handily.
Yeah, and he kind of says like, I'm going to be with you, whatever you decide, which is true. He'll stick with him, but he knows what Tulip said. Yeah. See, she was like, it's over. Like, he does it, it's over, and there's no question. And so it seems like a deliberate choice to tell them like, he wants
it'll be okay.
But he doesn't want to tell him. He wants to leave it. He wants to leave the choice in Jesse's hands, which is very important to note, I think. Okay. He doesn't want Jesse to say, Cassidy told me that he doesn't want anything to do with it. He just wants to say, like, I think you'll make it, and you will have to decide, sort of thing. Yeah, it's interesting. You can put the gun. You can put the gun in his hand, but he's not making him pull the trigger. Yeah, but he's not making him put the gun down either. He's like, oops, here's a gun. Yeah, what are you gonna do? The gun being metaphorical here.
All right, Act 5, Jesse comes home and after some comedic confusion reveals that he didn't kill Victor but got divorce papers from him. Cassidy seems sarcastically relieved, especially after he lies to Tulip and says, I think he's I told him. Well, I'll get to that in a second. I apologize. Victor flashes back a few years when Tulip left him in the middle of a Monopoly game after getting a call from Danny saying she knows where Carlos is. In present day, Victor's daughter comes in, and after he puts the gun down at her intrusion, he starts to read to her because she can't sleep after offering target practice in the basement. Like any good father would do.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, the Saint of Killers pays them a visit, and he kills Victor, but Allie tells the Saint that she knows where the preacher is. A couple things. So, before we get into any real big discussion, the big words that flash when you flash back to when Tulip left Victor says it was a few years earlier, which feels weird to me.
Well, a few years earlier was the confrontation between Cassidy and Tulip, wasn't it? Wasn't it a few months earlier for Victor?
No. Like I double checked it because I think I just took these notes and I was like, did that say a few years? And then I went back and checked it, and it says a few years earlier. Okay. Which feels very strange because that kind of implies to me, like, what I get out of this sequence is that Danny calls up Tulip and is like, I know where Carlos is, but you got to get this map for me, which is what she's doing in the first season, in the first episode. Even.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like it's been a few years since the pilot of the show. You know, I don't think there's any way that that's possible. I could buy a couple months. I could buy 6 months, you know, but even getting to the point where like Cassidy and Tulip and Jesse have been around each other for a year feels weird to me. So I don't know if that was just a mistake on their part or...
Unless Danny had...
Danny strung her along for a few things.
Maybe she made her do... Although she was working with her willingly, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah, there's an inconsistency there then, if that's the case. I remember being confused by the time as well, because I thought it said a few years... I don't remember. Oh, I'm confused.
Because there's a few... It says a few months... No, because what happens is... They replayed part of the Carlos incident, and then they said a few months later.
Yeah.
And that's when Jesse's in the apartment being a deadbeat, doing nothing.
Okay.
Tulip's coming home. That's the other title card that's in this one. Because then later on, when Victor's flashing back, it says a few years earlier.
Okay. Maybe, I mean, a few could be 2. So maybe, you know, if Cass and...
It just felt a little weird to me.
That's true.
So, but yeah, what I was getting to very poorly as I was reading my little summary is that Cassidy tells Tulip that Victor's still alive, but he doesn't elaborate on what he said when she asks him. And he instead lies, and he says that he told Jesse to do the right thing, which he didn't tell him to do the wrong thing, but he didn't tell him to do the right thing either, as you said at the end of the last part. So even more to Cassidy's deceit, which, to be honest, breezed right past me the first few.
That's what I'm saying.
Like it's
great.
It surprised me. It surprises me even as we were talking about it, how much deceit there was.
There's a lot of subtext there,
plainly in view.
And it's an important thing to consider. I think, you know, with a character like that, you have to think that he's been around for so long.
Yeah,
he's seen a lot, and he's done a lot, and he's had a lot of practice at a lot of things. So you can't even just be alive for that long without knowing how to talk to people and knowing how to get what you want out of people.
Yeah.
So I think
he's like, for some reason I'm getting this vision of like Quicksilver and X-Men like nudging bullets in certain ways to make sure they fly into the right courses as to what.
Yeah, that's maybe a little more precise than Cass.
Yeah, he's a bit more of a blunt tool than that, but
he's a very crafty guy, and I'm not trying to cast him in a completely awful light. He's not a supervillain, but there's just more to him than is presented, and I think the fact that you're picking up on it is awesome, and that Joe Gilgun, again, his performance is so layered, and he has this little part of it, and it's just by nature of the character is the Irish. I mean, as Americans, we're like suckers for people that have fun, intriguing European accents, especially British Isles people. Like there's no one here that doesn't love speaking to an English person.
Yep.
And Irishman even more. Like, he's just so phenomenal to listen to, and every little thing, like even the Sheets thing, like this, it just made me laugh out loud.
Yeah.
Like, there's some silky bastards.
Yeah.
Like an American character could sit down and be like, man, what's the thread count on these? And I would still laugh. Like Tom Haverford has a bit like that in Parks and Recreation. It's really funny.
Yeah.
But Cass has that extra little twist on it, and he knows what he has, and he uses it to quickly change, distract you.
And that's the thing, is that I feel like I was so in the pocket that, like, normally in any other, like in a lot of other shows, I feel like I would have seen it playing and been like, Cassidy's charm is working on them here.
Yeah.
But it totally, absolutely worked on me, which is
it's all
ridiculously
him.
good.
He is. I mean, the writing is obviously great, and the root of this character, again, Hennis and Dillon, but Joe Gilgun is just so good. And I remember when I saw he was cast, the only thing I really knew him from was Lockout, and I think maybe I saw him in something else. But I was like, that guy. I looked at him and I was like, him?
Yeah.
Because he just was so tall and like scrawny, and it just wasn't what I had seen in the books, and I was being too much of a stickler. Yeah. But I was like, whatever, he'll probably be fine. And then, like, as soon as the show started, I was like, oh, this guy is far and away the best person.
Well, and even, like, one of the things that I noted this time around that I know that we've probably seen before is just the funny trot that he does going up the stairs in Victor's house. It's just like, why is he doing that?
I know, for no reason. Yeah, he's like the Joker when he's walking out of the hospital with that stupid walk. You're like, what shit is he doing?
Yep.
And his weird, Cassidy's like weird, like flooded pants. It's like, he's just
absolutely.
You just look at him. You're like, I gotta hang out with this. I gotta talk to him. I gotta know what he's about.
Yep. I don't think there's much else with the Victor flashback.
It was really sad. I felt really sad for Victor. And what's his name? The actor?
Paul Ben Victor.
Paul Ben Victor. So good.
Yeah.
Like that. He is clearly he is really enamored with Tulip, and he knows she doesn't love him.
Yep.
It's very plain on his face that he knows it, and yet he still just really wants her around. She softens him a little bit or brings something out of him, and that look on his face, and he comes back in, and you can. I love when shows are willing to have smart characters.
Yeah.
It's so nice to see.
She's gone.
To see character. Well, it's just like he sees the board, and so immediately in his mind, there's been some kind of either struggle or someone ran out of here, and then he turns and he sees the dresser, and it's just plain on his face. He knows immediately what happened.
Yep.
And there's no like 7 stages of grief. There's no like, oh, maybe she's like, there's nothing. It's just plain on his face. He knows she is up and run, and he's not going to see her again, and it's so good.
Yeah.
Just fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then, I don't know, Victor's parenting relationship seems very unorthodox.
It's funny. I like it. It reminds me of Kick-Ass.
Yeah.
Big Daddy and Hit Girl.
Totally.
Which I think is funny.
And the Saint is hot on their tails, and he has somebody who knows where they are too. So
well, for now.
Yeah.
But yes, he's probably going to catch them unawares.
Yeah.
And that's what the Saint does best. I'm waiting for. I was a little disappointed. We got just the look on Victor's face as he's hearing the chaos downstairs. I'm looking forward to just a crazy, like, here's 20% of our season's budget shootout sequence with the Saint.
Yeah.
Did you watch the next week on?
I did, but I don't know that I know that what you're. Oh no, I know where we're headed, but I don't want to say anything on here.
Okay.
We can talk about it afterwards.
Oh, all right.
But yeah, I think that's about it for the episode. Back to a couple things real quick that Mike said when he emailed in on Monday.
Okay.
He said most of what happened on this week's episode wasn't in the books. It did, in a way, resolve in a different manner, and it in fact led to a major story that had nothing to do with Tulip's past. He wrote me later and said to remind you something about them seeing a former employer of Tulip's in Dallas. Does that ring any bells?
In regards to the show?
In regards to, like, I think he drew some parallels. Like, he felt mostly like this episode was not in the books, but it did remind him of a storyline in the books where they went to deal with something about Tulip's employer in Dallas, like a former employer in Dallas.
Yeah, I think I know what he's talking about.
Okay.
Maybe I'll have to just speed read the whole thing again, like this week.
Huh?
It was on my mind. Like, I was going through my iPad and like I was like, I'm going through my Comixology account, and I was like, what do I want to read? And I was like, ooh, maybe it's time.
But then the other point that Mike made this week, he said, lastly, I don't remember Jesse ever acting like that much of a prick in the book, but then he was your old-fashioned Southern gentleman, always so polite and good-hearted, and Lord help you if you fucked with him or his.
Right.
Even what he did to Arseface in the book, he didn't realize what he did and was genuinely taken aback when he realized it. For some reason, they are making him much more unlikable. I'm still not sure how I feel about it. Same goes for this episode. Didn't like it at first, but I'm still processing. Hell, I didn't like most of the first season up until the finale wrapped it up.
So Mike definitely seems like a very devout fan of the book.
Yeah,
which is great.
Absolutely.
I'm not holding that against him at all. I know a friend of mine is extremely rigid. He did not like season 1 of the show. Like, straight up, he's like, I hate it. And I was like, why? And he's like, it's not Preacher. And I was like, okay. I mean, yes, but what's the point then? Like, and maybe he's just like, I'm not going to watch it because I don't like it, and it's not Preacher to me. And that's fair. That's fair. But at the same time, it's not. I think it's
hard
nice
when your feelings of the source material don't allow you to enjoy the new stuff that an adaptation might bring to it.
Right.
But I get it. Those things are so closely tied together that it totally makes sense. But and here's the thing that I want to say is that as somebody who hasn't read the books, I didn't come out of that episode feeling like Jesse's unlikable. Like, I'm still very much, and I don't know if it's just the fondness that I've built up for him over the past season and a half. I don't even think he's presented that likable in the first place, but I like him anyway, is kind of what I get out of it. And so even with the actions of today, like, I think, or of this episode, I feel like I understood where he came from. And I think what Mike is mostly referring to is the moment with Tulip in the past about, the like him calling Tulip out for not wanting the normal life and her being an O'Hare. Like, that to me felt like an argument that they've had 1,000 times, kind of, and not really something that he's going out of his way to be a dick about. But I don't know. Like, I don't think I walked away the same way. But as I noted, I didn't read the book, so it's not like I have an idea of the Southern gentleman Jesse that.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're not making him less likable. They're not making him unlikable. They're just humanizing him. They're making him into a character. And in the book, he's a comic book character. And I don't mean that in a negative way.
Pejorative.
Lots of comic book characters can be very three-dimensional.
Yeah.
And Jesse does have depth to him, but for the most part, I mean, even in Mike's summary of who he is, he's kind of a good old boy, and don't mess with him and his, and that's him in a nutshell, and that's him pretty much fully fleshed out in the book. Like, he does have a lot of interesting past, but he has never really changed much. He's been mostly the same since he was a kid, all the way up until, the end of the book. He's kind of the same guy.
Yeah.
And they could have adapted that Jesse for the show, and I think initially that's what I wanted. And I think part of me still kind of does want more of that aspect of him, because watching Dominic Cooper work within that world of that particular Jesse is really fun. Mm-hmm. The scene in season 1 where he's at the bar and he kicks the shit out of all those guys is so satisfying. Yeah. Partially because it's a great action sequence, but also because Dominic Cooper embodies that so much better than I thought he would. Yeah. Like, I had all these ideas in my mind who was going to play Jesse Custer, what he was going to look like and act like. And then when I saw Dominic Cooper was cast, I was like, him? Because I knew him from Need for Speed and all the Marvel films, that kind of thing. And then I saw a picture of him on set, and I was like, the costume was great, but, like, his hair is not the hair, which is obviously a good decision because the hair is ridiculous. And I love, like I noted in season 1, that they tried it. They did, like, a costume test with the hair, and they're like, it's just too...
They're like, we can't do anything with this.
Exactly, yeah. So it was a good decision, and turning Jesse into more of a three-dimensional character is a good decision. And, if you're really gonna get into his corner, I think it's good that he has some flaws. It makes him more relatable, and it makes you want to root for him more because you want to see him overcome the flaws.
It's a little bit more of that, like a dimensionality, like a well-rounded person.
Yeah, and it may not necessarily be as much fun to watch, like on the surface, but you will get a better journey out of it. Like, I think it's probably more fun to watch like Ant-Man, for example. And if we're going to go movies, I love Ant-Man. I love the character, and I like what they did with it a lot, but it's much more satisfying to watch Bruce Wayne's journey, even in just Batman Begins alone, because he has faults and flaws that are deep and that are human. It's not like, oh, sorry, you had to work at Baskin-Robbins. Like, that's sad.
Yeah.
Those are about as far as Paul Rudd's Ant-Man's flaws go. Even his crime is like noble. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The thing that sent him to jail. So, spoilers for Ant-Man. He works at Baskin-Robbins. I think that I see what Mike is saying, and I think that taking a beat to try to reconcile the idea that it's just going to be a different character is important, and it's something I had to do like in season 1, like while we were watching it, while we were recording this show. I had to like sometimes step back and go
you can hear Nick's deliberations on this. Like I feel like by the end of the season, it was a bit of a roller coaster, because I feel like as things were diverging, you were like, I don't know if we're ever really going to get to what the comics were.
Right.
Whereas by the finale, you're like, okay, that was kind of issue 0 with things shuffled in from later.
Yeah.
Because of Odin King canon and such.
And I think part of that is just, taking up any sort of film or movie criticism in general, you need to be able to do that. Yeah. And even if it's just as simple as you talking with your buddies, I think it's an important thing that I wish I had learned earlier on. Yeah. Like Alex and I and our friends have had for the last like 10 years almost, like just hundreds of parking lot post-movie discussions about movies, and I can't help, although they're always fun and they're kind of what inspired us to do this kind of stuff. I think they could have been a lot more fruitful if earlier on I was able to divorce myself from.
Yeah, we all let our guard down a little bit more and didn't necessarily like dig in on something that we righteously felt was not adapted perfectly,
Yeah, see our Pain and Gain episode for two bulls unwilling to back down.
The adaptation of Pain and Gain.
I just mean like that,
but yeah,
those sort of things. It's good to keep your mind open, and I think that it not only will make things easier, but also you can get a lot more out of it. Yeah, having an open mind, even for anything really, any just movies in general. But also, when works are being adapted, I think it's pretty important. It's something I've had to learn with like the Marvel films, because early on I was real crotchety about a lot of diversions, even from source material. But at the end of the day, as Alex has said for years, you will still have the source material to go back to. Yeah, and that was a lesson that I learned in high school, because my high school girlfriend at the time did not like the Harry Potter movies because she was such a big Harry Potter fan. And I was disappointed because I never, we wouldn't go to see them. And then for some reason, she'd go on vacation and see them anyway with her mom, because her mom can't. And I would get so pissed because I was like, she's like, I didn't really like it. And I'm like, well, now I can't go see Order of the Phoenix because nobody wants to go with me. So, having her so steadfastly loving the books, to me, made me realize that having that staunch, this isn't what the other copy of it is like, is a little bit of a it's kind of a reductive position to hold. It's absolutely being unwilling to see the gold that another adaptation could bring to something. So it is harder when you're younger. To be fair, absolutely. I mean, even 4 years ago, the notion of a Dark Tower adaptation, I threw my arms up, and I still kind of am. Yeah. But there's so much built into this one that ultimately I can kind of Mission Impossible it and disavow any knowledge of it, and it won't matter. I feel like season 1 of Preacher was a great way, if you held through it. Speaking as somebody who hasn't read the comics, I feel like that season was designed to show you that there's worth in this adaptation, even if it's not going to be shot for shot. I would say you're correct, because if the first season hadn't happened the way it had, I probably would be, with where we are in the middle of the season, I'd be like, what the shit are we doing? Yeah. Because again, they got on with the comics for like an episode, and now it's totally left forked again, and it's off into its own thing. And while I am enjoying it, at the same time, it's in the back of my mind. Yeah. Like I'm giving the show slack. I think if you get through this season and you don't feel like we've hit some of those important things from the comic, you're going to be disappointed. I am. And I fully, completely appreciate and understand that. So I think it's something we'll have to take stock of after the finale. Yeah, the nature of any adaptation, I mean, you are obviously free to make some changes and adapt. But
what works in comic may not work in movie, and
Correct.
vice versa.
But also, you have the reason that story is worth adapting is in the DNA of it somewhere.
Yeah.
The skeleton of Preacher exists.
Yep.
And if you're going to adapt it and kind of reconfigure it slightly for TV, I'm all for it. But it needs to still be Preacher.
You need to find that meaning of what Preacher as a movie is. Like how to extract that important DNA, those dominant genes, and put it into the movie in a way that successfully, like, that's what the successful adaptation is to me.
Yes.
It's not this moment's on page 7 of issue 33. It's I came out of this feeling like Jesse Custer went on a similar journey that he did in the books, or even just that you're walking away with those same feelings.
Yes.
That
Absolutely.
you did after reading.
And while the temptation of seeing a page to screen perfect adaptation will always exist, like, would I love to see somebody simultaneously, like, adapting the book directly? I would fucking love that. Like, don't get me wrong, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
But I've read it before. I've seen it. I know what's going to happen. And it's fun. Well, I think it's fun to watch those kind of things happen. I don't think it's mature, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Like, I think we're kind of getting away from the staying so true to the source material, especially like the Marvel stuff.
Yeah. And
sometimes it has different effects. Like, I thought they did a good job adapting Doctor Strange, for example. They stayed relatively true to his origin, and they brought it into a modern era. They explained magic in a way that works. I thought it was an awesome movie, but like Spider-Man Homecoming is more heavily based. It feels like kind of an Ultimate Spider-Man, but it's kind of also doing its own thing. And while I think it was a fun watch, it wasn't as satisfying to me. And
even the themes of Ultron in the Marvel Cinematic Universe fall very flat, whereas I know you had a lot more strong feelings about it from the comics.
Absolutely.
Just the ideas of your
creation. The themes of Ultron in the movie, I mean, they set them up with the noblest of intentions, but they fall flat just by function of them. The movie, unfortunately, did not live up to its premise.
Yeah.
But its premise in the books is even better than the premise they set up in the movies, and it's so fascinating. And I think Westworld does like a better job of some of those key questions that Ultron asks. Anyway, we're talking about different things.
Yeah.
Now. But I think, can you watch Watchmen? Like, where it's probably the most like direct page to screen adaptation that exists. Alongside 300, just kind of the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so long. Like, Watchmen is it's cool. It's really cool to see that come to life. But then the parts where they choose to deviate are not good.
And even like the function of like swapping back and forth between like Tales of the Black Freighter and stuff like that in the like super ultimate director's cut or whatever turbo remix, whatever it's called. That doesn't work in a movie form, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
It doesn't work at all. It could maybe work in an episodic television form. That's a whole nother discussion.
That's only for your hardcore, like most diehard of fans, and that's a minority,
I
would say. So I think with Preacher, they're doing a good job keeping the spirit of it.
Mm-hmm.
But my patience it's on a week-to-week basis. So each week I kind of look forward to watching it. I'm always excited to watch it, but I think this could be the episode that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, where I go, you know what, we're just too far away now. I'm ready for this New Orleans business to be done. I feel like it is now, or should be, because obviously Tulip's business in New Orleans is now settled. So this was episode 5. So 6 will get us about halfway. So I think if the New Orleans arc closes off on next week's episode, which it feels like it's heading towards a shootout climax of the Saint of Killers showing up, that's really exciting. But they need to get back on the trail of God. So we've done a good job talking about Tulip's past and fleshing her out more, and we need to get to getting back on the trail of God, and we need to get more into Jesse's past, because they've been teasing it this season, and it's really enticing, and I think they're going to do a great job with it. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Awesome.
And I like that we got the little hint of Cassidy here.
Yeah.
It happens in the books, I think, a little early. You get a little shade of it, but not enough to make you take notice your first time through, and I think that was very appropriate. Cassidy can go back to being Cassidy, and we'll see where it goes. I'm really excited.
Me too.
This was much better than last week's episode.
Yeah. Once again, you can find more episodes of our podcast on g2tpodcast.com. That's the letter G, number 2, letter T, podcast.com. We're also on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, and Google Play Music Podcasts. We are also G2T Podcast on Twitter, and you can email us at g2tpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you think of our podcast and share your thoughts on AMC's Preacher so we can read them on our show. Send us corrections, observations, or anything regarding Preacher or our podcast. Apologies for the late episode this week. I got to see Tom Petty last night. But if you want to know when we're going to be a little bit late, follow us on Twitter or on Facebook. I let you guys know there. The Midwest Podcast Network has other shows about video games, horror movies, and HBO's Westworld. To find out more about these shows, as well as how to support the network, go to MidwestPodcastNetwork.com. Our theme music is the song All In by The Red Thread, and it is being used under a non-commercial Creative Commons license. That's all for this episode of Gone to Texas. We can't wait to see what next week's episode of Preacher brings, but until then, go forth and speak the good word.